Hi, everyone. Welcome to our monthly Advances in Autism Research and Care webinar. We're thrilled to have you. A quick housekeeping reminder before we get started. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be uploaded to our network YouTube channel. So if there's anybody who couldn't make it today, we'll be sending out the link following the presentation and you will be able to view this on YouTube. The second reminder is that we will have a brief question and answer session at the end for the presenter. You will see on the doc on your screen that there is a question section. You can send those questions. I will be able to collect them and then we will read them out to the presenter at the end. So without further ado, I am going to unmute Dr. Dan Corey, who is our network clinical director, and he is going to do the introduction for our presenter today. Thanks, Dan.
Great, thanks very much, Lucy. One of the things that we often struggle with in doing our research is trying to make sure that we have populations that represent the general population of people on the autism spectrum. Some of our sites have difficulty identifying diverse populations to recruit, and then once identifying them, have difficulty keeping them and retaining them in studies. Our presenter today is Dr. Jonathan Jackson, the Executive Director of the Community Access, Recruitment, and Engagement Research Center at Massachusetts General Hospital. Dr. Jackson is also a cognitive neuroscientist who investigates the early detection of Alzheimer's disease, and specializes in identifying and overcoming barriers to clinical research for people and communities of color. Today, he's going to be presenting to us on creating and sustaining diverse study enrollment. So I will turn things over now to Dr. Jackson.
All right, thank you for the kind invitation, and I appreciate your flexibility and rescheduling. I know that I was supposed to offer an initial presentation back in March, but I know that COVID-19 has broken our sense of time, so hopefully it doesn't feel like it's too long of a lapse. Again, thanks to especially Lucy for helping me coordinate this talk, and I'm really glad to be here today. I'm going to be talking about how we can achieve diverse study enrollment, and instead of just giving you a long list of best practices, which I will do towards the end of the talk, what I really want to focus on is how we can be scientifically rigorous in trying to achieve representative recruitment in our research studies. So I'm going to be pulling from a lot of examples from a bunch of different research fields, including my own home field of cognitive neuroscience, especially when it comes to dementia and Alzheimer's disease. But I hope that you'll appreciate that these examples, as far as I can tell, generalize across the broader spectrum of clinical and observational research. So in terms of the goals that we're trying to do today, there are three things that I'm hoping we can take away from this presentation. So one is to make sure that we have a clear understanding of what recruitment science is and how it's connected to diversity, because they're not quite the same thing. The next thing is to talk about some of the early data from this field of recruitment science on how we can better quantify and engagement and recruitment practices. And then at the end, as I promised earlier, I'll just give you like a few very concrete suggestions to help bolster your recruitment practices, and then I'll open it up for questions. Disclosure work. So part of the Care Research Center's mission, which I direct, is to do a number of community engagement events. So we, in a typical year, we average about 60 to 80 events. And so some of that work, not all of it by any means, is sponsored by the Otsuka Foundation. They do not have any impact on my research, which is instead supported by various institutes and centers of the NIH, as well as generous grants and generous support from the Michael J. Fox Foundation and Mass General Hospital. I do need to point out, none of these groups pay me enough to lie or to mislead. And so the things that I am saying here, if there are any mistakes or errors, they are entirely self-inflicted. The first thing that I wanted to mention today is to talk about the history of recruitment science and how it's connected to our modern notions of diversity. And it turns out that when we think about recruitment, whether we think about it as a science or just as a general difficulty that we have to attend to when we're trying to accomplish our research studies, that it is deeply connected to diversity and kind of a long and sordid history of medical abuses in the United States. So there's this quote that I like to kind of start things off with. It's a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. At the end of the Selma marches back in 1965, where he states, "Of all forms of inequality, injustice in healthcare is the most shocking and inhuman." There are a few flavors of this quote floating around on the internet, but a recent effort, so well, I guess it's been about 4 years now, kind of definitively uses this version of the words. So what's interesting is that even though this was given by Martin Luther King Jr. at the height of the Selma marches, this quote was directly referring to the Tuskegee syphilis study, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. And instead of talking about Tuskegee as an egregious and ethical lapse on the part of medical researchers, an exploitation of poor Black sharecroppers in Macon County, Alabama, or even the fact that the study went on for 40 years, what I want you to think of it is that Tuskegee serves as the origin of diverse recruitment. The Tuskegee syphilis study was one of the first studies anywhere that had a very, very clear population in mind and was able to attract, retain, and ultimately recruited individuals and kind of made their families complicit in the study as well. And they were able to keep people in the study for decades at a time. Now, it may make people on the call uncomfortable for me to be drawing these comparisons using language that we use to this day when it comes to research studies and recruitment, especially for longitudinal studies. However, I do need to point out that when we're studying the origins of any field, we need to talk about the dark and sordid history. So just as when we are talking about neurology, we have to start with the dark and sordid history of phrenology and its roots in racism. Similarly, we need to talk about the origin of diverse recruitment and recruitment in general. By all accounts, this really starts with the Tuskegee syphilis study. So for those of you who are a little bit less aware, syphilis victims in the Tuskegee study went untreated for 40 years, even though penicillin was widely available very early into the study design. So this was published by Jean Heller on July 25th, 1972, and the study was shut down within just a few weeks. However, and I think what's really crucial to remember here is that although it's very easy to villainize individuals who ran the study, which was the U.S. Public Health Service and a handful of researchers around the United States, that there is a very familiar sense of justification for many aspects of the study design. So what I've got next is a clip from a 1993 Nova special on the Tuskegee study, which actually features a quote from one of the original researchers. So hopefully people will be able to hear it through the computer audio.
One of the few surviving public health service doctors who worked on the study still defends that decision. John Cutler.
It was important. They were supposedly untreated, and it would be undesirable to go ahead and use large amounts of penicillin to treat the disease because you'd interfere with the study.
So hopefully everybody heard that, but the crux of the quote is that it would be undesirable to treat individuals living with syphilis because it would interfere with the study goals. And so as another uncomfortable truth is that we often design our research studies to serve the needs of the research scientists and to serve the needs of the principal investigators, to serve the needs of the research question, and it sometimes comes at the cost of the people who are prospectively interested in getting involved, and as well as the individuals who do end up enrolling in the study. So we have to keep in mind that the language that was used to justify the Tuskegee syphilis study is very similar to the language that makes it difficult to enroll and retain diverse individuals to this day. Well, so I promise this is not going to be a kind of a civil rights soapbox. but this is a really, really crucial look into the history of recruitment science. And so we need to talk about what happened after the Tuskegee study, which is that the Belmont Commission was formed in 1974. And in 1979, they published their report. And all of us remember from undergraduate psychology, or maybe even high school psychology, that the Belmont Report had these three crucial pinnacles or pillars for research that govern all human subjects research to this day: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. It is my argument over the next few slides that we've gotten pretty good at respect for persons. We do give people informed consent, and we've gotten pretty good at beneficence, where we are making sure that we are doing no harm to others. We are still working on this concept of justice, as is reflected by measures of diversity and inclusion. Now, when it comes to thinking about diversity and inclusion, what are the federal research guidelines? What are we obligated to do in this space? So I think what I can say here is that there's a lot of ambition, particularly with regards to various policies implemented by the National Institutes of Health, as well as the Food and Drug Administration. There was the Revitalization Act of '93, the inclusion of women and minorities in 2001, which was recently revised last year to include individuals across the lifespan. We know that there are special populations offices within various ICs at the NIH. And I didn't try to exhaustively document the different kinds of guidances, declarations, and strategies that the FDA has come up with, including new draft guidance just from last summer. But it seems as though every year is the year of the minority, according to the FDA. And so it does seem as though that the largest federal agencies that or grant-making organizations in this space are very, very invested in inclusive and diverse policies. So, but a question remains: why is it that we need to recruit diversely? Sometimes it seems like something that's nice to have, but honestly, if it's not something that you can do on time and on budget, or in a way that would slow down your research, it seems like maybe it could be optional. So why is diversity important? Is it really primarily driven by a need to achieve some kind of goals, relatively vague goals of social justice? The answer is no. And so I think what we have to keep in mind is that beyond measures of social justice, beyond measures of morality, beyond measures of political correctness, or whatever you'd like to call it, there's a scientific justification to making sure that your research is diverse or representative as much as you can make it. So we know that from work done 5 years ago now by Ramamurthy and colleagues, that 1 in 5 FDA approvals, so this is for biologics as well as devices, have some sort of differential exposure or response on the basis of race or ethnicity alone. We know that usually these factors are examined in phase 4, post FDA approval. However, it's important to remember that even in early phases, if you're doing clinical trials, or even if you're looking at observational research where you are hoping to generalize to a broader population, that there are these differences that are conditioned usually on various social determinants of health. So while this study focused on race and ethnicity, the same is likely going to be true when it comes to matters related to gender, annual household income, residence, especially if you are living in a rural area, and years of education, things of that nature. We know that representation issues are particularly acute in our most advanced areas of research. So if you think about the relatively nascent fields of precision and personalized medicine, we know that there are representation issues there. My next slide will cover that in more detail. We know that, from work from social and general epidemiology, that selection and survival biases, which is to say recruiting non-diversely, tends to skew estimates of causal factors. And I have a relatively dramatic example of this taken from dementia research that I'll be showing later in the slide. But keep in mind that not recruiting in a way that is representative or generalizable means that the research question that is central to your goals may not be answered robustly, or may not be answered in a way that itself generalizes. So the reason why diversity is crucial for clinical research is is pretty simple. It helps us do better research, and it helps us make sure that we are more confident in our research-driven conclusions. So as promised, this is the article that I mentioned that talks about representation in genetic and genomic databases, as well as a number of phenotypic databases. So this is published by Latrice Landry out of Harvard Medical School a couple of years ago. And what's really nice about this is that it actually hasn't changed much in 2 years. But what we see here is that the representation across a GWAS database is largely European. That is also true in terms of phenotypic databases of cancer, cardiovascular disease, neurology, respiratory diseases, and a whole host of other phenotypic databases. So not only are these individuals likely to be European, they're likely to be Western European individuals who are based in the United States, on the coasts of the United States, the east and west coast of the United States. They are likely to be men. They are likely to be a little bit middle-aged or older, and they are likely to be highly educated and highly wealthy. And so, reliance on big data means that we are not able to fully generalize to a number of populations. And what you can see here most strikingly is that when it comes to neurology and respiratory databases, there are entire groups that are missing. So the orange group refers collectively to URGs, which is just all underrepresented groups. Asian refers primarily to East Asian databases. Most of these are located in China. And so what's, again, really important to state here is that these databases are not necessarily interchangeable. They're not necessarily harmonized. They tend to be federated. So even though we do have a lack of diversity, it's actually much more stark than it appears on these graphs, because the European data sets are largely federated from the ones that reflect Asian populations. So you can see here that if we are generalizing to the population broadly based on representation that we have here, we are unlikely to do a good job. Now, if you think about clinical trial representation in the United States, this is taken from the clinical trial snapshot published by the FDA every year. So the 2019 data came out back in February. If you look at trying to compare the representation that you see based on the US population, you can think, across both these categories, we're doing pretty good. However, those of you who are mindful of measures of central tendency know that the average, the mean, covers all manners of sin. And if you pull out the median, which is a less biased measure of central tendency, you can see that for certain underrepresented groups, particularly Black and African Americans, as well as individuals represented in terms of those who are 65 and older, the representation in terms of median estimates across all clinical trials, all FDA approvals last year is quite stark. You can actually calculate measures of dispersion, which are just as informative as measures of central tendency. So here I use the coefficient of variation, which is also known as a relative standard deviation, to show that certain populations, such as Black and African Americans, Asians, as well as those who are 65 plus, have relatively large relative standard deviations, relatively large COV estimates, which shows that not only is the median much lower than the mean, but there's a lot of variability from study to study. So some studies have lots of representation of these populations, some really have relatively little. So we can see that the numbers, that the average is a little deceptive here by comparing it to the median, and even those measures of central tendency are themselves deceptive because there's a lot of variability from study to study. So now moving on to talking about early data in terms of understanding a science of recruitment and how that is connected to research. I wanted to talk about one of my favorite papers that was published last year by Milo Rasuli and colleagues out of Columbia, which talks about just comparing 7 different very classic recruitment methods to a research study looking at trying to obtain genetic data from individuals. So what you can see here is that the blue refers to those who were initially screened, all the way to red, which refers to individuals who actually provided that baseline data that came in for that baseline visit. What's really striking here is how seductive the biobank and electronic health record methods are in terms of drawing our attention and drawing our eyes. you can see that using these methods, you can reach a very large number of people for the screening process. But in terms of bang for your buck, if you look down on those in terms of those orange or red bars, individuals who actually came in to provide data, you're getting a small fraction of those individuals actually coming into your studies. And in terms of converting the proportion of individuals that you are initially reaching to those who provide baseline data, you can see that you get better bang for your buck for virtually any other common recruitment method. So using your staff network to spread by word of mouth, community events, different kinds of flyers, these are much more likely to fully engage folks and bring them into your studies, even though it seems like it seems perhaps more justifiable to use these relatively large data sets with a really small conversion rate. You can actually convert the same data into a marginal cost per enrollee. And so you can see that the biobank and EHR methods are actually quite expensive in terms of your ability to recruit participants. And that's usually because normally we don't often consider additional or hidden costs when it comes to recruiting these individuals, which usually comes in the form of research assistant time and effort. So it usually takes them multiple calls to bring in individuals, only to lose them, at the enrollment stage. And in terms of bang for your buck, literal bang for your buck by estimating the marginal cost, you can see that clinic recruitment is a relatively safe bet, but it's not terribly generalizable. More community-oriented, more kind of representative-oriented methods are also relatively inexpensive. If you calculate the cost of the event, as well as the time and effort of your team to develop these events. So that is certainly worth thinking about. Now, if you're also trying to talk about diversity, I've included this very, very busy slide on purpose and drawn a red box around the part that I want you to orient to. So what you can see here is if there's a plus, it means that one of the 7 methods is pretty good at recruiting that kind of group. So individuals who are less than 45 or over 65, individuals who are male or various races and ethnicities. What I'm hoping that you will draw from this is that it's pretty hard for any one recruitment method to recruit broadly across various groups related to diversity. And so that is on purpose, and that's for a reason, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. But keep in mind, there is no kind of magic bullet. There is no one-size-fits-all approach. Unfortunately, if you are trying to look for a broad set of representative samples, you either have to be literally doing it all, or you have to maybe fundamentally change your approach. I'll have some ideas on that in just a few slides. Now, my next slide is sort of the promised dramatic example of what it might look like if we do recruitment, but we do a relatively poor job of it. So in the world of dementia and Alzheimer's disease, one of the things that we know with relative confidence is that Black and African Americans are about twice as likely to develop dementia as white populations, as relatively privileged white populations. What we'll see here on this Kaplan-Meier curve is not that relationship. So what we see here, for those of you who are maybe a little bit rusty at reading Kaplan-Meier curves, is that white individuals and white individuals and Black individuals who were all mildly cognitively impaired at baseline, then progressed to full and frank dementia. But you can see that the rate of progression for the whites, who are reflected here in the red line, is much, much faster. That line is much, much steeper than it is for Blacks. And so if you were to make your basis for disparate recruitment or health disparities in terms of race alone on the basis of this graph, you would reasonably conclude that white people are about 2 to 3 times more likely to progress to frank dementia relative to Blacks. And so what's surprising about this graph is that it comes from the National Alzheimer's Clinical Consortium data set, which is about 12,000 individuals. It's one of the largest data sets that we have in the dementia space. And what we are seeing here very consistently, very clearly, there are no typos or mistakes on this graph, is that white people are more likely to get dementia than Black people, which contradicts every epidemiological study, most observational research studies, and is a bit of a head scratcher. The problem is here that the efforts to recruit diversely, there was a bit of a problem. So the issue with recruitment here is that it was conflated. The recruitment method was conflated with the racial identity of the group member. And so if I were to say, that all of the white people on this graph were recruited from a clinic and all of the black people were recruited from the community, then suddenly this pattern makes a lot more sense. And what we're seeing is not a difference between white and black people. We're seeing a difference in the progression to dementia between a sample that was recruited from the clinic, which is reflected by the white trend line, and those who were recruited from the community, which is the black trend line. So if you're running a memory clinic and you're getting a lot of your white participants from there, then of course they are much more likely to progress to dementia than a community-derived sample, which obviously has a lower base rate. So what happens if you are not careful with your recruitment source, and as you are looking for that diverse sample, is that you may conflate these factors, and otherwise then you may run the risk of trying to essentialize differences that don't actually exist in your sample. So keep in mind that if you're recruiting diversely, you have to recruit the same kinds of people from using the multiple methods. So don't expect to recruit all of your diverse subjects using a single method, whereas your non-diverse subjects from another method. So just to quickly summarize the state of inclusion science, the state of recruitment science more broadly, there are a lot of peer-reviewed manuscripts across every discipline, but there is no way to unify the various theories that have been presented. And then for those of you who have done some reading around this, you might find that the conclusions tend towards advice that is relatively generic. It is difficult to operationalize, replicate, or even frankly measure. There are lots and lots of confounds. I think the cheeky question that I have here is most of our diverse recruitment just the byproduct of charismatic, underpaid CRCs? I think this question might be unfair because maybe it's not CRCs, maybe it's RAs as well. But fundamentally, the problem is that we know that it is the individuals on our front lines that really drives any kind of recruitment, especially when it comes to recruitment of special populations. We don't have a clear idea and definition of minority. As you noted on my previous slides, you might have seen that minority could have been defined as somebody who's over the age of 65. It could have been defined vaguely as Asian because we don't really know what that means either. And there are lots of additional confounds in the field that haven't been really well clarified or explained or robustly or organized. And that is in part because the infrastructure in recruitment or inclusion science is pretty much absent. There are not really a lot of resources or tools. There's not really a lot of time that PIs and study teams have to dedicate to specific recruitment activities. And then finally, when it comes to engagement and recruitment, these activities tend to be completely separate from the concrete aspects within our SOPs and our protocols. So let's get to the meat, the heart of the matter, which is why can't we recruit diversely? What's the trouble there? What I've listed here are the top 10 reasons that we can't recruit diversely. So those of you who are old enough to remember Letterman might think of this as a top 10 list. And so what you see here is that there are a lot of reasons that I think will probably resonate with some of you. What's interesting, though, is that I'm betting that if we surveyed all of you on the call, you might come up with different reasons that might be particularly important to you. And so that raises a really, really crucial question. If you have all 10 of these reasons that may be present in different amounts or different proportions or with different levels of priority or importance, how do you navigate these 10 in order to address recruitment issues? In a perfect world with unlimited time and money, we would make sure that we had very careful processes to really solve and address each and every one of these issues. But unfortunately, we don't live in such a world. So how do we handle that? What I would like to propose is that we can workflow these issues according to a set of steps that I'm going to outline here. So if you have your top 10 reasons, what you might be able to do is that you can actually map these on to an ordered workflow where you start with the sampling frame, you move through the steps of awareness, engagement, interest, and then you get to the parts of the workflow that we are much more familiar with, being researchers, where you talk about screening, randomization, and retention. So for example, if you think of some of these top 10 reasons will map right on to this ordered workflow that I'm proposing here. Some of them will map onto multiple levels. And then obviously some of these barriers within the workflow will map onto, will map onto multiple barriers in our top 10 list, such as the numerous barriers that we see at the screening stage, and then so on and so forth, where you can see that if you are perhaps not doing a great job of orienting to barriers early on in this workflow, say at the awareness level, your solutions at the later levels, such as solutions at screening or randomization, may not register. They may not be visible because you have not taken care of these earlier barriers that are that are kind of cropping up earlier in your process or in your workflow. So you can think of it this way, where having a very clearly defined sampling frame, which is different than your catchment area, having a very, so basically making sure that you have a very precisely defined denominator from which to draw, will then allow you to reach out and do that awareness, build up engagement and interest, and then finally bring in individuals for screening, randomization, and retention. What may be striking is that this is not necessarily a recruitment plan that is specific to diverse audiences, but it's just a recruitment plan. It turns out that part of the problem for recruiting diversely is that we tend to have gaps in our workflow, and diverse populations may be disproportionately vulnerable to those gaps, and so we lose them somewhere along the way, usually somewhere within these 7 stages that I'm proposing here. So keep in mind that of the 7 stages that I'm proposing, there are really only 3 that are commonly addressed through our research protocols: screening, randomization, and retention. The others typically fall outside of that process, and if we do not specifically attend to them, then we run the risk of collapsing those additional levels at the level of screening. So more specifically, we tend to find ourselves, for those of you who have ever done a consent, we tend to find ourselves handling elements related to the sampling frame, awareness, engagement, trust, interest, and education, all at that level of signing the consent document, where we have to do a lot of patient education and engagement at the time where they're looking through what tends to be a very long and complicated document. So instead of collapsing them to that single point of contact, what I'm recommending is that you engage in additional activities that stretch out that process, make it a little bit less burdensome, both for prospective participants as well as study teams. Now, I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples. I'm going to try to go very fast here so that we have plenty of time for discussion. But I did this, I was able to leverage this framework through a couple of studies. One study was just a quick pilot study where there is a longitudinal study of cognitive impairment that's embedded as a minor protocol at 59 sites, study sites around the United States. The study itself is pretty intensive. 9 visits over 4 years for individuals who are cognitively normal, who have some sort of mild cognitive impairment or frank Alzheimer's disease. The study visits include MRI, they include a lumbar puncture. There's no return of results or information to participants. And so there's very low minority recruitment, in this case, referring to racial and ethnic groups other than Western European white. So what you can see here is that there's not really a great incentive for people to participate in this study. So it's an observational study. You have to do about as much as you do for a clinical trial, but you don't have any hope of receiving a therapeutic. So what we did was my group solicited proposals for a 5-month intervention. We had 4 sites kind of scattered around the United States. We had the sites identify a specific barrier that they were going to try to overcome, as well as a very detailed intervention plan that was oriented to that specific barrier, give them around $40,000. And just to help you orient, this study was really designed to help individuals map out these 3 stages of the 7-stage process where we're focused on awareness, engagement, and interest. So we can see that the identified barriers that the sites came up with fell outside of that typical research workflow. So these were not barriers necessarily that came up at the time of screening, randomization, or retention, but they did come up at the level of awareness, engagement, and interest. Most of the interventions focused on directly engaging lay and public communities. So one site did engage with minority-serving physicians. And here's some details about the study itself. We monitored sites from August to December of 2018. And then last summer, summer of 2019, I was able to check in with the sites. At that time, 3 of the 4 had already returned to their pre-intervention engagement activities. So they had effectively stopped doing the intervention that they had proposed. And so we can take a look at how sites did. So sites that had sort of typical levels of engagement are reflected here in terms of the top workflow. And so what I'm trying to illustrate here is that we can start to operationalize our methods of recruitment by connecting them to our methods in our data for engagement. So you can see here that one site, which is reflected on the top 2 graphs here, we're trying to reach out to Black and African Americans. They were able to reach out to a few individuals, and they were able to engage them, but they were not able to bring them in all the way through that workflow, and ultimately were not able to recruit or enroll any of the individuals that they reached out to. On the other hand, another site that has relatively deep entrenchment practices that are already in place, we're able to engage a much larger number of individuals, and then at each successive stage, they were able to bring in a larger and larger percentage, and ultimately were able to recruit and enroll a large percentage of individuals relative to the proportion that they ultimately reached out to. So what you're seeing here in terms of the percentages for the inverted pyramids on the right is relative to the stage above it. So that 75% is of the 53%, which is of the 60% in total. So you can see here that sites that perform that deep engagement are able to retain a larger percentage at each successive stage. And by modeling your data this way, you can really identify where those bottlenecks occur. So the site that has this typical level of engagement has lots of opportunities to improve. But if they're looking for a quick win, they might want to convert a larger percentage of those 18% that were engaged and try to bring them in. You could actually map this out another way by looking at a spider chart where there are 5 key dimensions about trying to make sure that your study site, your study staff are well equipped to engage with a diverse audience. And so there are a number of really strong conclusions here. So what we found is that across the 4 pilot sites, they recruited a third of all minority participants across the 59 site network in a 12-month period. And then the most successful sites shifted the recruitment burden from the underrepresented minorities and assumed it themselves as study teams. So they recognized that the burden really fell on their shoulders in order to improve recruitment there. The final point is, I think, really crucial here. The establishment of engagement metrics separate from enrollment also really helps. So what gets measured tends to get maintained. So there are still some challenges. This was a very, very small pilot study, but the question is, can we systematically address barriers in a comparative design? Can we really be broader about how we're defining what a minority is? And so again, very quickly here, what we see from a partnership that we've done with the Michael J. Fox Foundation is help them improve enrollment to an online study called Fox Insight, which is run by the Michael J. Fox Foundation. And if you look at the baseline levels of diversity in this digital study, I've mapped them out here. If you can't read some of the labels here, just know that it is white for a reason. It's about 90% white as of 2018. It turns out that it's not just a matter of racial and ethnic diversity, but if you additionally look at diversity of income, diversity of educational attainment, things of that nature, you can see that the sample is relatively privileged in those domains as well. So what we did was we did a study that was designed to focus on multiple barriers we also found ourselves including that sampling frame estimate, and we had a very broad definition of minority. So instead of just thinking about race and ethnicity, we also included gender minorities. In the Parkinson's disease space, that does include women. We thought about trying to look for measures of education, income, and rural status. So like I said here, we had a strong focus on defining that sampling frame. Ultimately, you want to have a good denominator to compare against, because that helps you manage your expectations in terms of who you're recruiting into your study. And it's good to have that denominator separate for each group that you're hoping to attract to your protocol. So what we did here is we had 8 sites, 4 control, 4 active intervention sites. Just like we saw with the previous study, sites were able to pre-identify the barrier, the population, the intervention, and then we did a 5-month intervention study, and we were able to give sites a little bit of money to take care of this. So the pre-intervention phase launched September 2019. The study wrapped up right as coronavirus was hitting the United States in early March. And so what we ultimately found is that number one, there were a number of digital and language barriers. We had about depending on the site, we had somewhere between 20 and 80% loss because of these barriers. So keep in mind that designing for digital equity and language equity is a must if you want to attract and retain a diverse sample. One thing that I haven't noticed is that trust is not a major factor for either of these studies. We as researchers tend to think that trust is the end-all be-all kind of barrier when it comes to recruiting diversely. It turns out that it's not, at least especially if you're trying to recruit individuals who are already well engaged with your system. And so what you can see here is that what we did is we compared intervention sites, control sites, and baseline sites in terms of diverse enrollment. So baseline refers to the ability of the 8 sites in the study to recruit diverse populations that are non-white, that are Hispanic or Latinx, that are low income or low education. And as you can see here, both intervention and control sites did a great job when it comes to recruiting racially and ethnically diverse populations, but intervention sites were able to recruit individuals very, very broadly across these categories. So just to let you know that merely orienting to these elements of diversity but not doing anything about it, as we saw in the control condition, is enough to boost your numbers a bit. But if you want to boost them broadly and have truly representative samples, it does require a bit of additional interventions. So what we need to keep in mind is that working with communities is usually a good idea. It's good to develop independent, idiosyncratic solutions based on what you know about your population. So it's always good to find somebody local and ask them what's important and value the information that we're getting from them. So in terms of broad advice, if you are trying to achieve some sort of diversity in your study sample, here's what you need to do. Separate your catchment area from your sampling frame, and put another way, get a better denominator. So try to avoid that fallacy of overestimating participant willingness. We know that it's a well-documented phenomenon known as Lasagna's law. It's been around. It's been documented since the 70s. Be very thoughtful about implementing quick fixes from other sites. Keep in mind that no matter what your solution set is, you almost certainly have an awareness problem that needs fixing. Something that I always like to tell people when I provide research consultations on recruitment is you have to remember that you're super weird. Nobody knows what research is. Definitely nobody knows what research that's oriented to different kinds of health disorders are. And so we can't necessarily write our advertisements, write our engagement on the basis of the assumption that people already know what these things are. We have to do that initial education about what research is before we can get anyone to care about our specific protocol. And then this 4th point, which seems obvious, but tends to be really hard when you're in the weeds. If you want to get new people in your study, you have to do new things. You can't necessarily do something that is relatively low effort or low inconvenience on your part. And then the last point is almost certainly the most important. I studied mind wandering for a number of years, so I know that I've been speaking for about 45 minutes. You've probably taken about 20 minutes of what I said, if that. If you remember one thing, remember this last point. The experts in this they're not going to be the PIs. They're not going to be the co-Is. They're definitely going to be the CRCs and RAs. They know what the barriers are. They hear about them. And if you have any doubt about this, just be scientific. Go out and measure some stuff. Come back, tell me that I'm wrong. But I think what you do want to trust is if you don't want to trust me or trust the things that are in here, trust your CRCs and RAs because they really, really do see what these barriers are like in terms of trying to recruit a good population. If you want some more concrete advice, here are 4 good points. Use plain language for everything, including your informed consent documents. Language equity shouldn't be the problem that it is, but at least let's get English right. If you can only do English, that's fine, but make sure that you're aiming for a 5th grade reading level for all of your materials. If you use clinician champions and research ambassadors, that does get you a long way. It helps you with that awareness and engagement section that I was talking about earlier. And if you can't necessarily do some of these things, make sure that there's a strong return of value. Make it easy or interesting or fun to participate in your study. And if your study is just not that fun, make sure that you're giving people some interesting data. These data don't need to be central to your research questions. So for example, if you have to draw, if you have to draw blood for your study, then it's important that maybe you run a lipid panel. That may not be part of your research question, but it would be informative and useful and hopefully not that expensive to provide to your research participants. Sustained community entrenchment does work, but it takes time. The magic number seems to be about 7 years of doing good work before you see a return on your investment. So, don't expect to be able to achieve any of this within 3 to 4 days, which is something that we as PIs often do. Last set of concrete advice, schedule visits with the patient in mind. Keep in mind low traffic times of day. So this is obviously, for a world pre and post coronavirus. Make sure that there are participation options for individuals who do not screen into your study because these are still individuals who are interested in research. So finding something for them to do makes a lot of sense and makes you look good and makes them feel good. And then do a combination of media outreach. Again, your CRCs and RAs are better at this than PIs and co-Is. And a media presence gives you a solid set of engagement metrics. And at the end, remember what gets measured gets maintained. Instead of basing everything on the back of enrollment data, you should be basing things on terms of reaching an ever larger set of the public and the lay communities, which I would recommend using engagement metrics to map that out. And then, of course, this is the advice that I'm sure many of you have heard many times, but making sure that your study team is as diverse as possible at all levels is good advice. But if diversity remains tough, it remains out of reach, the last thing that I'll say is look for local voices, not just faces that reflect the group that you want. So it's better to have somebody that's local than somebody who is maybe racially concordant. Because usually the local voices understand how to communicate with local communities. And in the end, that is what you're looking for, more than just trying to have brown faces recruiting brown faces. So the promise of tomorrow's medicines, treatments, and therapies is really very much in your hands. I'm happy to kind of pause and answer a few more questions, but thanks so much for your time and attention.
Thanks very much, Dr. Jackson. The first question is a combined question and comment. So it goes as follows. Fantastic presentation. Do you have any thoughts about recruiting when you're recruiting children through their families? I assume your ideas apply, but are there additional considerations when working with parents?
Yeah, so I think that if you are working with multiple groups, so in this case, children and parents, obviously the recruitment issue becomes slightly more complex. So I think that some clusters of researchers are really, really good at designing studies that are appealing for the children. They can keep them occupied, and it can also be informative for the scientific questions. But usually what hooks the parents in is that return of information. So as you know, as I was talking about earlier, where if you have to draw blood, maybe running a couple of extra tests would be informative here. So if you are running, say, cognitive or attentional assessments for kids who are living with autism, being able to return that information, whether it is individual level data, which is always best, but if you're not able to do that, returning information in the aggregate works really well too. So a low cost way of doing that is maybe twice a year holding a webinar just like this one, where you run through some of the data that you've gathered and how it would impact the parents' lives in terms of trying to manage the day-to-day of their children, whether they are living with a disease or disorder or not, is really, really informative. So, obviously, payment is great, trust and engagement is great, but at the end of the day, if you want to really attract people, especially parents, into a study, give them information about their kids that they can't get themselves. And that is usually the name of the game when it comes to research like this. Other questions?
Thank you. Next question we have is, what role can clinicians play in helping to recruit diversely from populations for studies?
Oh, that's a fantastic question. So I didn't include this on my presentation because I'm still trying to figure out how best to present it. But the answer is shockingly clear, which is to adopt a policy of talking to every single person that you run into about research, making that a very consistent ask and making that a consistent conversation. It seems to be a surefire way of increasing diversity. So many of us, may sort of lament the fact that our patient population just isn't that diverse. I guarantee you, it's more diverse than you think. So in the Parkinson study, we had a couple of sites that either were already talking to all patients about research or implemented this as a part of their intervention. And number one, those sites did amazing when it came to diverse recruitment. And number two, those sites did amazing when it came to just recruitment. So finding a way to introduce your research workflow into your clinic flow, serving as like a clinician champion, and making sure that you find, even if it's just 30 seconds, 15 seconds, talking about research opportunities without necessarily talking about specific research protocols, is a great way to organically improve diversity for your studies. So making that a consistent conversation, a consistent ask. If you can't do it as a study clinician, making sure that someone on your team is able to have that conversation. It seems to be a very, very consistent way of improving diversity.
Yeah. Next question is, do you have advice or suggestions for reaching and engaging the local voices you mentioned?
I'm sorry, the end of that question was a little garbled. Reaching who?
Excuse me, reaching the local voices that you had mentioned a couple slides ago.
Oh, yeah. So local voices, again, just to contextualize the comment, local voice, like if you have to pick, local voices are better than diverse voices. Local and diverse is best, but if you have to pick one, I would opt for local. If you are not able, through the connections that you already have, to reach local voices, you should always look out for advocacy groups. You can look out for individuals who are maybe connected to your clinic. So my guess is that you may have staff members who could recommend a couple of people to start with. And then I think if you are just generally in a bubble from anybody that's local, then you might look even online at like Facebook groups and looking for people who are particularly active in Facebook groups that are studying the thing that you want to study. Let's say it is autism, and then reaching out proactively to some of those individuals. And then what I would recommend is if you can pay them, please pay them. It doesn't have to be much. It could be like $25 for an hour conversation. but try to pay them and protect them and show them that you value their time, and then keep them around, keep them included, because when you have a great engagement of local voices, you can then leverage those same voices to serve as research ambassadors that can then go back to their own communities and tell them and talk about the research studies that you're doing. So it actually serves two purposes. My guess is that through your own research labs or clinics, you can probably reach someone local. But if you can't, starting with something like Facebook, looking at Facebook groups might help. You can also reach out to various disease or disorder advocacy groups because they are usually really, really well connected to local voices too.
Thank you. We probably have one more question in the time remaining. So the final question and comment says, thank you for the wonderful presentation. We would love to share this information more broadly with our site and in our broader network. Do you have suggestions on how to do so?
So is the question about sharing information from this presentation or like best practices, or I don't know if you can clarify.
My assumption is information from this particular presentation.
Oh, well, I mean, information from this presentation, I'm always happy to share slides. So I will email them to you, Lucy, and you can share these, far and wide. I'm not particularly protective of this intellectual property. So you can share these slides as often as you'd like. The other thing that I would recommend in the time that's remaining is, so my research center is based out of Mass General Hospital in Boston. We actually have a good chunk of our time that's dedicated to offering research consultations. So anybody who is interested in up to 6 free hours of recruitment consultations, whether you're looking for diverse samples or not, email me. So my email is on the slides. It's jjackson31@partners.org. And so we'll give you 6 hours of our time at no charge. If you want a lot more than that, or if you want us to manage your recruitment, that also is relatively inexpensive, but not free, unfortunately. But please get in touch with us if you need help, because what I've offered here is pretty generic. If you want more detailed tips or information, set up a meeting with us. I promise we can make a difference in as little as 1 hour. So please get in touch.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Jackson, I wanted to say on behalf of our network and our audience, thank you very much for the wonderful presentation. And a reminder to all the audience members, the link to the recording will be uploaded to YouTube and will also be sent out to everyone. So thanks very much, Dr. Jackson. Thank you very much to our audience, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right, thanks. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.